There is something about floodwater that feels older than any memory we carry inside us. Not the water itself, but the silence that comes after, when everything familiar has been erased completely. Thousands of years ago, someone pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and recorded an order that was never supposed to reach human ears, never supposed to be written down at all. But it was written down, and the tablet survived, and now, 4,000 years later, we can read it. What Enlil ordered before the Great Flood was not simply destruction. It was something far more specific and far more disturbing. If you are settling in for the night right now, this is exactly the kind of ancient mystery worth falling asleep to. Subscribe and stick around. Tonight we're going deep into the oldest forbidden knowledge ever recorded on Earth. To understand what Enlil ordered, you first need to understand who Enlil actually was in the Sumerian world. He wasn't just another god in a crowded pantheon. He was the one the other gods were afraid of. The Sumerians called him the Lord of the Command, the god whose word, once spoken, could not be undone by anyone. Scene 11B, search, Enlil Sumerian god temple Nippur vertical bar zoom. His temple at Nippur was called the Eker, the mountain house. It was considered the axis of the entire cosmos, the point where heaven and earth connected. Scene 11, see image, massive step temple structure rising above a flat plain, imposing and solitary against a vast sky. Warm afternoon light casting its long shadow eastward vertical bar zoom and out. Every other city's patron god acknowledged Enlil's supremacy. Even Enki, who was older and arguably wiser, deferred to Enlil's authority in all formal matters. Scene 11D, image, stone relief showing a procession of divine figures approaching a central seated figure, each bowing slightly. Warm torchlight on the carved limestone surface vertical bar pan left. Not even the other gods could overrule Enlil. When he made a decree, it became the fabric of reality itself. And this is important, because the decision to destroy humanity was not made by one god acting alone. It was made in a divine assembly, a council of gods who gathered to debate the fate of every living thing. The Atrahasis epic, one of the oldest written narratives ever found, gives us the details of that assembly. And what those details reveal is not what most people expect when they hear the phrase, the Great Flood, because according to these tablets, the flood was not a punishment for sin. That came later, in different traditions entirely. The Sumerian version is older and stranger, and in many ways, much harder to explain away as simple mythology. In the beginning, according to these tablets, there were no humans at all. The gods themselves did all the labor. They dug the canals, they hauled the earth, they maintained the irrigation systems that kept the divine cities running. And this is where the story takes its first strange turn, because the gods who did this labor were not happy about it. They were called the Igigi, the younger gods, the worker class of the divine hierarchy, who answered directly to Enlil. For thousands of years, the Igigi dug and hauled and built, and the tablets say they grew bitter with resentment. The work never ended. Every canal needed maintenance, every field needed irrigation. The divine infrastructure demanded constant, back-breaking effort without any rest. Scene 24B, video, slow tracking, shot along a deep trench being dug in hard earth, wooden tools embedded in the walls. Warm torchlight at intervals along the trench, and then, around 300 years into their servitude, according to the tablets, the Igigi reached their breaking point and acted together. Scene 24C, image, burning wooden tools piled in a heap at the base of a temple wall. Orange flames reflected on the stone surface, dark night sky above vertical bar zoom, and they burned their tools. They surrounded Enlil's temple in the middle of the night. They refused to work ever again. Scene 24D, video, slow wide shot of flickering torchlight reflected off the walls of a large temple complex at night, shadows of many gathered figures visible on the ground. The noise of their protest woke Enlil from sleep. The same complaint that would later be used against humanity was first directed at the gods themselves. Scene 24E, image, startled figure sitting upright on a stone sleeping platform, harsh torchlight suddenly flooding through a doorway. Alarmed expression, dramatic warm to cold. Lighting shift, vertical bar zoom. This was the first rebellion in recorded literature. Thousands of years before any biblical narrative, the gods themselves went on strike. And Enlil's response was not compassion. His first instinct was to find the ringleader and execute them publicly as an example. But another god intervened. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposed a different solution entirely. Enki suggested they create a new being, something that could carry the burden of labor so the gods would never have to work again. They would mix the clay of the earth with the blood of a sacrificed god, and from that mixture, humanity would be born. The god they chose to sacrifice was one of the rebels. His flesh and blood were mixed with the clay to give humans divine intelligence. Scene 30B, image, dark stone altar with a ceremonial stone blade resting on the surface. Small clay bowl beside it, warm flickering firelight from a single brazier. Solemn atmosphere vertical bar, zoom in. His name was Geshtui, which translates roughly as ear or understanding. The god of intelligence was killed so his essence could pass into the clay. Scene 30C, video, slow close. Cup of dark red liquid being poured into a stone basin containing wet clay, the two substances mixing together. Warm firelight from below the tablets say that when the mixture was complete, the first human heartbeat could be heard. A pulse that hadn't existed in the world before that moment. Scene 30D image, close. Up of a clay surface with a faint rhythmic indentation pattern, like a heartbeat pressed into the material from inside. Warm amber-focused lighting vertical bar zoom. This detail matters because it means humans carried divine substance inside them from the very beginning. They were not purely mortal creations made from ordinary earth. Scene 30E image, translucent figure with a faint golden glow visible inside the chest. Standing in a dark space, warm internal light contrasting with cool dark exterior vertical bar zoom. Out they had a piece of a god's mind inside them. Which means when Enlil ordered the flood, he was also ordering the destruction of divine essence. Scene 30F video, slow push in on a small glowing ember sitting on a dark stone floor. Warm orange light pulsing gently as if alive. Darkness pressing in from all sides. And for a while, this solution worked perfectly. Humans did the labor, the gods rested. The canals were maintained and the cities thrived. But humans did something the gods hadn't anticipated. Something that would eventually lead to Enlil's terrible order. They multiplied. Generation after generation, the human population grew until it covered the land in every direction. Scene 33B image, 4 sequential frames, showing a village growing from a few huts to a small town to a sprawling settlement. Warm progression of light from dawn to noon vertical bar pan right. The tablets describe this growth not as centuries but as a relatively rapid expansion that caught the gods off guard with its sheer scale. Scene 33C video. Slow overhead shot of a model showing concentric rings of settlement expanding outward from a central point. Warm golden light illuminating the expanding frontier, and the noise they made, according to the Atrahasis tablets, was so loud it rose up to the heavens where the gods lived. Enlil could not sleep. The tablets are explicit about this. The noise of humanity kept the Lord of the Command awake. Now, this might sound like a trivial complaint. A god who can't sleep because his creation is too noisy downstairs. But scholars who study these texts point out that the noise is likely a metaphor for something much more significant than literal sound. The Sumerian word for noise in these passages carries connotations of chaos, disorder, rebellion, and overpopulation all at once. What Enlil heard wasn't just volume. It was the sound of a creation that had grown beyond any boundary he had set for it. And this is where the tablets describe something that sounds remarkably like a series of biological weapons deployed against an entire species. Before the flood, Enlil tried other methods first. He ordered plague. He ordered drought. He ordered famine across the entire land. Scene 41b image, illustration of a dark cloud descending over a village, people covering their faces and retreating indoors, warm but sickly yellow. Green lighting vertical bar zoom, the plague came first. The tablets describe it spreading through every settlement, people falling sick in numbers that overwhelmed any healer's knowledge. Scene 41c video, slow tracking shot of empty market stalls in a village, goods abandoned on tables. No people visible, wind blowing cloth awnings, warm but desolate afternoon light. But Enki whispered through his priests, "Pray to Namtar, the plague god, make offerings specifically to him, and the plague will relent and leave your people." Scene 41d image, hands placing a small clay offering vessel at the base of a stone altar, smoke from incense rising in thin streams, warm devotional lamplight vertical bar zoom in, and it worked. The plague withdrew, the population recovered, and Enlil was furious that his first strike had been quietly neutralized from within. Each time, the human population was supposed to collapse. Each time, it was supposed to solve the problem permanently. Scene 42b, video, slow overhead shot of a dried reservoir, cracked mud patterns visible from above, salt deposits, white against dark earth, harsh, bright overhead sunlight. The drought lasted years according to some versions of the text. Rivers shrank to trickles, fields turned to dust across the entire river plain. Scene 42c image, skeletal remains of fish scattered on a dry, cracked riverbed, sun-bleached and brittle. Harsh white noon light with no shadows or relief, vertical bar pan left. And again Enki intervened. He directed the surviving fish to gather at specific river bends where humans could still net them for food. And each time it failed, because each time Enki secretly intervened and taught the humans how to survive what Enlil had sent. Enki told them to pray to the god of plague to end the plague. He told them which rivers still held fish during the drought. Every time Enlil struck, Enki quietly opened a back door, and every time the human population recovered and continued growing. The tablets describe Enlil's growing fury, not just at humanity now, but at Enki for undermining his authority repeatedly. And this is where we reach the assembly, the divine council, where Enlil finally proposed the solution no god could quietly undermine. He called every god together, Enki, Anu, the sky, father, Nintu, the mother goddess, and every lesser deity who held any authority. And Enlil made his case. Humanity had failed every test of containment. Every plague had been circumvented. Every famine had been survived. The only solution left was total annihilation. Not a plague that could be cured, not a drought that could be outlasted. Water, enough water to cover every piece of land where a human being could stand, breathe, or find shelter of any kind. Scene 51b, video, slow rising shot from ground level looking up at dark clouds gathering and thickening. First heavy raindrops beginning to fall. Cold gray-blue light overhead. Not a local flood. Not a seasonal river overflow. A complete inundation designed by the most powerful being in the cosmos to erase an entire species. Scene 51c image, globe-like sphere with water covering every visible surface. No landmass showing, cold blue-gray tones, faint light from behind creating a silhouette effect. Vertical bar, zoom, out. But the flood itself was only half of Enlil's order. The other half is the part that most retellings leave out entirely. Enlil made every god in that assembly swear an oath. A binding divine oath that no god could break without cosmic consequences. The oath was simple and absolute. No god was permitted to warn any human being about what was coming for them. Think about what that means for a moment. The gods had created humanity specifically to serve them and carry their burden, and now the god in charge had ordered that these same beings be drowned without warning, without explanation, without any chance to appeal. The humans would go to sleep one night in a world that made sense, and wake up to a world that was ending all around them. No time to gather their families, no time to climb to higher ground, no time to ask what they had done to deserve it. And this is the detail that separates the Sumerian flood from every version that came after it in later civilizations. In the biblical version, God warns Noah directly. In the Sumerian version, the warning was explicitly forbidden by the highest authority. The flood was designed to be a surprise. That was the entire point of the oath. Humanity was not supposed to have any chance at all. But Enki, the god who had created humanity in the first place, could not bring himself to watch his creation vanish silently. And this is where the most famous scene in all of Sumerian literature takes place. A scene built entirely around a legal technicality. Enki had sworn the oath. He could not warn a human directly. But the oath said nothing about speaking to a wall. So Enki went to the reed hut where a man named Ziusudra slept, and instead of speaking to Ziusudra, he spoke to the wall. "Reed wall, hear my words. Reed wall, pay attention to what I say. Tear down this house and build a boat instead." Ziusudra, lying on the other side of that wall, heard every word, and Enki knew he would hear every single word. It was the oldest loophole in recorded history. The god of wisdom outsmarting the god of authority on a pure technicality of language. And Ziusudra began to build. According to the tablets, the boat was enormous and required stripping his entire house for materials. The dimensions described in the text are specific, not vague poetic language. Exact measurements given in Sumerian units of length. Scene 70B video. Slow tracking shot along the hull of a large wooden vessel under construction. Rope lashings visible, pitch being applied to seams. Warm work light atmosphere. Some versions describe the vessel as perfectly square. Others describe it as a round coracle scaled up to impossible dimensions with multiple internal decks. Scene 70C, image. Cross-section diagram scratched into clay showing a multi-level vessel interior with compartments. Warm amber lamplight on the sketched surface, vertical bar zooming. Enki's instructions were precise. Seal the hull with bitumen inside and out. Load provisions for 7 days. Bring aboard the animals and your family. Scene 70D, image. Dark viscous bitumen being spread across wooden planks with a flat tool. Glossy black surface reflecting warm firelight. Waterproofing in progress, vertical bar zoom 7 days. That is all the warning Ziusudra received through a wall of reeds. 7 days to build the impossible and load everything worth saving. Scene 70E, video. Time compressed slow motion of activity around a vessel. Figures moving with urgency carrying bundles and baskets up a ramp. Warm, golden, chaotic daylight. His neighbors asked him what he was doing. And here the tablets give us another detail that most people have never heard. Enki had told Ziusudra exactly what to say. Tell them that Enlil has rejected you, and that you must leave the city by water. Tell them that where you are going, bread will rain from the sky, and fish will fall from the heavens in abundance. In other words, Enki told Ziusudra to make his departure sound like a blessing, not an escape from annihilation coming for everyone. The neighbors would have no reason to build their own boats. They would think Ziusudra was the one being punished, not them. If you are drifting off right now, that is perfectly fine. These mysteries will still be here waiting when you wake up. Now, let's go deeper into what the tablets tell us about the days just before the water came, and what the gods actually did. The Atrahasis tablets describe the final days before the flood with a level of specific detail that has puzzled scholars for decades. On the appointed day, the weather changed. The tablets describe a darkness that gathered at the horizon, like nothing anyone had seen before. Adad, the storm god, began to roar in the clouds. The text says his attendants went before him, marching over mountain and plain. Nergal, the god of the underworld, tore away the support posts of the sky. The metaphor is terrifyingly specific in the original text. Ninurta, the war god, opened the dams. The tablets distinguish between rain from above and water surging upward from underground sources below. This wasn't just rain. According to the text, the foundations of the earth itself were broken open from underneath simultaneously. And then comes one of the most disturbing passages in all of ancient literature. A passage about what the gods themselves felt watching. The gods were cowering like dogs. They crouched against the outer wall of heaven. The goddess Ishtar cried out like a woman in labor. "How could I have ordered the destruction of my people?" she said. "I gave birth to these humans, and now they fill the sea like fish." The tablets say the gods sat weeping alongside Ishtar, all of them, even the ones who had voted for the flood in the assembly. They had known intellectually what they were ordering, but the reality of watching it happen broke something in them completely. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm raged. The tablets are consistent on this number across multiple independent copies found centuries apart. Scene 88B video. Slow aerial shot of dark churning water covering everything below. No land features visible. Heavy rain falling from above. Cold gray light everywhere. The description of those 6 days reads like the account of someone who lived through a real catastrophe and remembered every horrible hour of it. Scene 88C, image, interior of a wooden vessel being battered, water spraying through seams, cargo sliding, oil lamp swinging wildly on a chain. Warm, chaotic interior light vertical bar zoom in on the 7th day. The storm subsided. The sea grew calm, and the tablets say there was complete silence for the first time since the rain began. Scene 88, D video. Slow wide shot of perfectly flat gray water stretching to every horizon. No movement, no sound, no wind, gray overcast sky, meeting gray water seamlessly. And during those 6 days, Enlil's order was carried out exactly as he had intended. Every human being on the open land perished. Scene 89B, image, muddy water receding from the upper stories of a partially submerged mud brick structure, waterline visible on the walls. Cold gray diffused natural light vertical bar zoom in. When Zushudra opened a hatch on the vessel and looked outside, the tablets say he fell to his knees and wept at what he saw. Scene 89C, video, slow push in from behind a kneeling figure at an open hatch. Looking outward at a vast flat expanse of muddy water, cold gray light flooding in through the opening. Every city that humans had built, every canal they had dug, every field they had planted, all of it was under the water. The only survivors were inside Ziushudra's boat, the one boat that existed because one god spoke to a reed wall instead of a person. Now here is where the story enters territory that makes the whole narrative feel less like mythology and more like a warning. When the waters finally receded and Zushudra opened the boat, he made an offering. He burned cedar and myrtle on the mountaintop. The tablets say the gods smelled the sweet offering and gathered around it like flies. They were starving for worship and sustenance. This is the part that changes everything about how we understand Enlil's order. Because Enlil arrived at the sacrifice scene last, and when he saw the boat, when he saw that humans had survived, the tablets say Enlil was filled with absolute fury. No human was supposed to survive the destruction. That was the entire point. That was what the oath was designed to guarantee. Enlil immediately knew it was Enki. No other god had the motivation or the cleverness to find a loophole in a divine oath. And Enki's defense is one of the most remarkable pieces of rhetoric in the entire ancient world. He didn't deny what he had done. Scene 99B, video. Medium close-up of a figure speaking calmly while a larger figure towers over him. Warm firelight between them. Composed body language despite the tension. He did not beg forgiveness. He stood before the most powerful god in the cosmos and argued his case on principle. Scene 99C, image, 2 footprints in stone, one much larger than the other, both facing each other, warm amber light from between them, creating long shadows, outward vertical bar zoom marn. He told Enlil that he had not broken the oath. He had not warned any human being. He had spoken to a wall made of reeds. If a mortal happened to be sleeping on the other side of that wall, Well, that was not Enki's responsibility or his concern. But Enki went further than just defending himself. He challenged the entire premise of Enlil's order directly to his face before the assembly. He said the punishment should fit the crime. If humans were too noisy, send a lion to thin the population. Send wolves or famine. Scene 103B, video, slow push in on a stone wall carving of a snarling predator in profile. Muscles defined in the relief. Warm torch. Like sidelighting emphasizing depth, or let disease take the weakest, or shorten their lifespan so each generation burns out before it can grow too numerous to manage. Scene 103C, image hourglass-shaped clay vessel with sand, or grain trickling through the narrow center. Warm focused lamplight on the flowing particles. Dark background, vertical bar zoom. But to destroy every single human when only some of them caused the problem was not justice. It was cruelty without purpose or proportion. And this argument, recorded on clay 4,000 years ago, reads like a philosophical debate about collective punishment that we still have today. The tablets say Enlil eventually calmed down. He looked at Zushudra and his wife and made a decision that no one expected. He granted them immortality. He sent them to live at the edge of the world, in Dilmun, the paradise where the sun rises each morning. The very god who ordered their destruction turned around and made them eternal. And the tablets never fully explain why he changed. Some scholars believe Enlil recognized that Enki's argument was correct, that total annihilation had been disproportionate, and the survivors proved it. Others believe Enlil simply recognized a political reality. The other gods had witnessed the flood's horror and would never support another one. Granting Zushudra immortality might have been less about mercy and more about preventing him from telling future generations what really happened. Send the witness to the edge of the world where no human can reach him. Make sure the story dies with the last person who lived it. But the story didn't die. Someone carved it into clay. Someone decided that what Enlil ordered needed to be remembered permanently. And this brings us to perhaps the most important question in this entire narrative. A question that scholars have debated for over a century. Why did the Sumerians write this story down? What was the purpose of preserving a tale where the gods tried to destroy you? Most ancient cultures wrote stories that glorified their gods, stories of divine generosity, creation, order brought from chaos and maintained by wisdom. The Sumerians wrote a story where the chief god secretly ordered the extermination of the entire human race without warning or justification. And they wrote it not as a cautionary tale about human behavior. They wrote it as a critique of divine authority itself. Enki is the hero of the story, not because he defied Enlil with force, but because he found a way around an unjust order using language. The Sumerians seemed to understand something that most later civilizations struggled with, that authority and justice are not the same thing at all. Enlil had absolute authority. His word literally could not be reversed. But having absolute authority did not make his decision just or correct. And this leads us into the territory that makes this particular ancient text relevant in ways that most mythology simply is not. Scene 122B video. Slow dolly shot through a modern research library aisle, ancient history section. Warm overhead lighting on book spines. Quiet scholarly atmosphere because Enlil's decision and Enki's response sit at the foundation of one of the oldest debates in all of human thought. Scene 122C, image, ancient stone carving, showing two figures with opposing gestures, one commanding downward and one reaching upward. Warm balanced sidelight on both vertical bar zoom. When does loyalty to authority stop being a virtue and start being complicity? The Sumerians carved their answer into permanent clay. Scene 122D image, crossroads carved into a stone floor, two paths leading in opposite directions. Warm torch placed at the junction casting equal light both ways, vertical bar zoom out, and their answer was nuanced. Enki didn't rebel openly. He didn't try to overthrow Enlil or start a war among the gods. Scene 122E video. Slow push in on a carved stone doorway with two pillars. One slightly taller than the other, warm interior light visible beyond the threshold. He found the narrowest possible path between obedience and justice. He technically followed the letter of his oath while completely violating its spirit. Scene 122F image. Thin golden thread winding through a maze drawn on a clay tablet surface, finding the one path through to the other side. Warm, focused lighting vertical bar zoom in. And the Sumerians, by making this the central heroic act of their most important narrative, were endorsing a very specific kind of moral reasoning, because there's a section of the Atrahasis that most popular retellings skip entirely. The section that describes what Enlil ordered after the flood. Once Enlil accepted that humanity would continue to exist, he imposed a new set of rules designed to prevent the same problem from occurring. And these rules are what no human was supposed to know about, because they reveal that the flood was not the end of Enlil's plan. The post-flood decrees included population controls. The tablets describe 3 specific measures that Enlil put in place for all future humanity. First, certain women would be designated as unable to bear children, not by choice, but by divine decree imposed from above. Second, a demon called the Pashitu would be sent to steal infants. The text describes this entity as a permanent fixture of the new world. Third, certain classes of women would be designated for temple service, roles that precluded them from having children of their own entirely. These 3 decrees, taken together, describe something that sounds remarkably like institutionalized population control embedded into the fabric of civilization itself. And the tablets present this not as something that happened long ago and ended. They present it as the current state of the world. The Sumerians who read these tablets were being told that the suffering they saw around them, the infertility, the infant mortality, the celibate priestesses, all existed because of a divine administrative decision made after a catastrophe. This was not random misfortune. This was policy. And the God who implemented it was the same God who had tried to kill everyone first. Now, there is a second layer to this that makes the story even more complicated, and it involves the number that appears throughout these texts. The Sumerian king list records that before the flood, 8 kings ruled for a combined total of 241,200 years. Other versions of the list extend this to 432,000 years. Numbers so impossibly large, they seem designed to resist rational explanation. Scholars have spent a century trying to explain these numbers. Some say they represent symbolic astronomical cycles, not literal years of rain. Others point out that 432,000 is exactly 120 cycles of 3,600, the Sumerian Great Circle unit. The number also appears in Hindu cosmology, Norse mythology, and several other traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years from Sumer. 432,000 shows up in the Rig Veda's calculation of cosmic ages. It appears in the Norse Edda as the number of warriors in Valhalla. Scene 140b, search, Kali Yuga, Hindu cosmology cycle. Vertical bar zoom in the Kali Yuga. The current age in Hindu cosmology is said to last exactly 432,000 years, the exact same number continent away. Scene 140c, image, ancient Sanskrit text on palm leaf manuscript, warm amber tones, delicate script visible in fine lines, warm, careful preservation. Lighting vertical bar, zoom. Some researchers have argued this is evidence of a shared source, a common origin point for these mythologies that predates all of them by millennia. Scene 141b video, slow overhead shot of a world map on a wooden desk with pins and thread connecting distant civilizations. Warm lamplight casting shadows from the raised pins. The thread connecting Sumer to India to Scandinavia is thin but persistent. The same number appearing independently 3 times strains the limits of coincidence. Scene 141c image, 3 identical cuneiform style number symbols arranged in a triangle formation on a dark surface, warm spotlight on each. Connecting light between them, vertical bar zoom. Others say it is simply what happens when cultures use base 60 mathematics. The same numbers recur naturally without requiring any shared cultural contact. But here is the thing that is difficult to dismiss. The Sumerians didn't just use this number casually. They embedded it into their most important records. The king list was not mythology to them. It was an administrative document. It recorded who ruled, for how long, and in what city. When we dismiss the pre-flood numbers as symbolic, we're making an assumption that the Sumerians themselves never indicated was correct anywhere in their writing. They wrote 241,200 years in the same format, and with the same grammatical structure as 63 years for a post-flood king. This doesn't mean the numbers are literally true, but it means the people who recorded them believed they were recording real administrative history. And if Enlil's order was embedded in this same record-keeping tradition, then the Sumerians treated it as history too, not as allegory or fairy tale. Which brings us to the most unsettling question of all, one that scholars rarely address directly because it sits outside comfortable academic boundaries. If the Sumerians believed Enlil's decrees were real and still in effect, what did they think they could do about it as ordinary human beings? The answer, based on the texts we have, is complicated. Because the Sumerians didn't respond to Enlil's authority with blind obedience or simple rebellion. They responded with something much more sophisticated. They worshipped Enlil and simultaneously preserved the story of his greatest injustice for all future generations. They built his temples, they sang his hymns, they made his offerings, and they also made sure every literate person knew what he had done. The Atrahasis epic was a school text. Scribes in training copied it as part of their education. This was not secret forbidden knowledge hidden in a vault. It was taught openly, which means the Sumerians wanted every educated person to know that the god they worshipped had once tried to annihilate them all. And this is perhaps the most remarkable thing about the entire Sumerian flood tradition. It is not a story of divine love or divine testing. It is a story about power, accountability, and the question of whether absolute authority has the right to make absolute decisions about who lives and dies. The Sumerians asked this question 4,000 years ago, and they preserved their answer in the most permanent medium they had available to them. They fired the clay. They made the tablets permanent. They stored them in libraries designed to outlast the buildings around them by centuries. And the message they preserved can be summarized in a way that still resonates today. Authority does not equal justice. Obedience does not equal morality. The God who could not be overruled made a decision that was wrong, and the God who was subordinate in authority found a way to do what was right anyway. Enki didn't overthrow Enlil. He didn't start a war in heaven. He spoke to a wall, and that was enough to save the human race. The smallest act of defiance, channeled through the cleverest possible method, was enough to undo the most powerful order ever given in Sumerian cosmology. And the Sumerians made sure we would know this 4,000 years later. Across languages and empires that they could never have imagined, we still know. The tablets survived conquest. They survived burial. They survived thousands of years underground in the ruins of cities that forgot they existed. And when archaeologists finally dug them up in the 1800s, the story of Enlil's order was still legible on the clay surface. Scene 166B, video, slow push-in on a sepia-toned recreation of a Victorian archaeological dig. Workers carefully excavating a mound. Expedition tents in background, warm natural daylight. The first tablets from Nineveh arrived in London packed in crates alongside broken pottery and fragments of palace sculpture, weighing several tons. Scene 166C, image. Wooden shipping crate packed with straw and clay tablet fragments partially opened. Warm gaslight from a Victorian warehouse interior, vertical bar zoom. And nobody knew what most of them said. The cuneiform script had been deciphered only recently, and thousands of fragments sat in museum storage waiting. Scene 166D image, long rows of shelves in a museum basement storage room. Boxes labeled with expedition numbers. Dim, warm overhead lighting, dusty and patient atmosphere. Vertical bar, Panorite. George Smith, working at the British Museum in 1872, was the first modern person to read the Babylonian version of the flood story. The accounts say he became so excited when he realized what he was reading that he began removing his clothes and running around the room. Scene 168B image, Victorian Museum workroom with gas lamps, wooden desk covered in plaster casts of tablets, magnifying glass, ink and notebooks. Warm period. Appropriate amber lighting, vertical bar zoom. He had been sorting through thousands of fragments from Nineveh, broken pieces of tablets that nobody had been able to read for over 2,000 years. Scene 168. C. Video, slow overhead shot of scattered clay tablet. Fragments on a large wooden table. Hands carefully arranging pieces by size and color, warm work lamp lighting. And then one fragment matched another. And the text that emerged described a flood, a boat, a man warned by a god, animals loaded aboard. Scene 1968D image. Two clay fragments being held together at a matching break line. The cuneiform text continuing seamlessly across the join. Warm, excited close-up lighting, vertical bar zoom, and Smith realized he was holding a story older than Genesis. A story that meant the biblical flood had a predecessor, a source, a deeper origin. He had just discovered that the biblical flood story had an older source, a source that told the same story but with completely different moral conclusions. In the biblical version, God is righteous. The flood is justified. Noah is saved because he alone was righteous among his generation. In the Sumerian version, Enlil is not righteous. The flood is not justified. Ziusudra is saved because another god committed an act of divine civil disobedience. The moral frameworks are almost exactly inverted, and the Sumerian version is older by at least 1,000 years based on the dating of the tablets we have. Scene 172B, Search, Epic of Gilgamesh Flood, Tablet 11, British Museum. Vertical bar, zoom in, the Babylonian version. The Epic of Gilgamesh Tablet 11 preserved much of the original Sumerian moral complexity, but was already beginning to smooth the edges. Scene 172C, image, 3 tablets arranged, left to right showing progression from oldest to newest, each slightly different in clay color and script style. Warm comparative museum lighting, vertical bar, pan right, by the time the story reached the Hebrew scribes, centuries later. The divine assembly was gone and the messy politics of the gods had been replaced. Scene 172D video, slow tracking shot of scrolls and tablets, arranged chronologically on a long display table. Warm gallery lighting, visible progression from clay to parchment to paper. This doesn't mean one version is true and the other false, but it means the story evolved. And as it evolved, the uncomfortable parts were removed. The divine assembly was removed. The population control decrees were removed. The gods weeping like dogs was removed. Enki's legal loophole was simplified into a direct warning. What survived into later traditions was a cleaner story. A story where divine authority is always right and questioning it is always wrong. But the original Sumerian version, the oldest version, tells a different story entirely. One where the god in charge made a catastrophic moral error. One where the subordinate god was the true hero. One where a wall made of reeds saved the entire future of the human species. And one where the aftermath of divine destruction included institutional systems designed to ensure humanity could never grow powerful enough to disturb the gods again. The Sumerians looked at the world around them and saw evidence of Enlil's post-flood decrees everywhere. In the infertility that some women experienced despite wanting children, in the children who died before their first year, in the priestesses who served the temple their entire lives without bearing children of their own. These were not random tragedies to the Sumerians. These were the ongoing consequences of a decision made by a god who had lost his patience. And the most sobering detail of all is that, according to these texts, the decrees were never rescinded. There is no tablet recording their end. Enlil granted Zushudra immortality. He allowed humanity to continue, but he never removed the population controls he had implemented after the flood. In the Sumerian understanding of the world, those decrees were still active, still shaping the conditions of human existence every single day. And perhaps that is what makes this story so different from every flood narrative that came after it in the traditions of later civilizations. It doesn't end with a rainbow and a promise. It doesn't end with a covenant between a loving God and a grateful survivor. It ends with a compromise between two gods who disagree about whether humans deserve to exist, and the compromise has conditions attached. Humanity gets to survive, but only within limits set by the God who tried to destroy them, and those limits are built into the architecture of daily life itself. Every woman who couldn't conceive, every child who didn't survive, every life dedicated to temple service, all of it was, in their understanding, by design. Not accident, not fate, not the random cruelty of an indifferent universe. Deliberate divine policy implemented by a specific God for specific reasons. And the God of wisdom, who had saved humanity once, could not save them from this, because the post-flood decrees were not hidden or secret. They were public, they were accepted. The other gods had agreed to them as the price of humanity's continued existence after the catastrophe. Enki could not speak to a reed wall about this. There was no loophole available. The deal had been made openly and accepted by everyone. This is the part of the story that the Sumerians found most important to preserve. Not just the flood itself, but what came after. The flood was dramatic. The flood was terrifying. But the post-flood decrees were the part that affected every single person who would ever live. And the Sumerians wrote it all down. They preserved it in their schools, their libraries, their temples. They made sure it would outlast them, because maybe that was the real act of defiance. Not Enki speaking to a wall, but humans writing down what they were never supposed to know. Enlil ordered the flood in secret. He bound the gods to silence. He designed a destruction that would come without any warning at all. And humans responded by creating the most durable information storage medium the ancient world ever produced and recording everything on it. Clay lasts longer than papyrus, longer than parchment, longer than paper. Some of these tablets have survived 4,000 years in readable condition. The medium itself was an act of defiance against forgetting, against the silence that Enlil had ordered, and the secrecy he had demanded. And now, 4,000 years later, we're reading those tablets in languages the Sumerians never imagined, in countries they never knew existed. The silence Enlil demanded lasted exactly as long as it took for one god to speak to a wall and one scribe to press a stylus into clay. These mysteries have been waiting thousands of years. They'll wait until morning. Sleep well. But before you drift away completely, there is one more thread to this story that deserves attention tonight. A thread that connects back to Enlil's original motivation. Remember, the tablets say, Enlil's reason for the flood was noise. Humanity had become too loud, too numerous, too disruptive to the divine order. But there is a detail in the older Sumerian versions that the later Babylonian copies softened. A detail about what the noise actually represented. Some translators argue that the Sumerian term translated as noise is closer in meaning to clamor for rights or demands made upon authority. If that reading is correct, then Enlil didn't destroy humanity because they were literally loud. He destroyed them because they were demanding something. And what could a population of beings created specifically to serve as a labor force possibly demand from their creators? Freedom, rest, fewer hours of digging canals and hauling earth. The same things the Ajiji had demanded before humans were created to replace them. The humans had become exactly like the worker gods they were built to replace. They had reached the same breaking point and started making the same demands. And Enlil's response was identical in both cases. When the Ajiji rebelled, his first instinct was to execute the ringleader. When humanity became too demanding, his solution was total extermination. The pattern is the same. The scale is the only thing that changed. This reading of the text transforms the flood from a natural disaster myth into something that looks remarkably like a labor dispute, escalated to apocalyptic proportions. Scene 215b. Image. Illustration of a wooden counting board with tokens representing workers on one side and divine figures on the other. Warm lamplight creating a strategic game atmosphere. Vertical bar zooms in. And this interpretation is not fringe scholarship. Multiple mainstream Assyriologists have published papers arguing that the noise metaphor encodes economic and social tension. Scene 215c, video, slow push in on an academic journal, open to an article about the atrahasis. Highlighted passages visible. Warm reading lamp on a desk in a quiet office. The creation of humans was itself an economic act. The gods needed labor and created beings specifically designed to provide that labor cheaply and permanently. Scene 215d image, assembly line of small clay human figurines being shaped on a workbench. Each identical. Warm workshop lamplight, casting repetitive shadows from each figure, vertical bar, pan right. The workers demanded better conditions. The manager responded by eliminating the entire workforce, and then he created new rules to prevent the replacement workforce from ever growing strong enough to make the same demands. The post-flood population controls make perfect sense in this framework. They weren't punishment for noise. They were structural prevention against future collective action. Keep the population small enough that they can do the work, but never large enough that they can organize and make demands the gods can't ignore. And the genius of the system, from Enlil's perspective, is that the controls look natural. Infertility looks like bad luck. Infant mortality looks like the cruelty of nature. The tablets reveal what sits behind the appearance of randomness. Not chance, but design. Not nature, but policy hidden inside the fabric of ordinary existence. And the Sumerians, by writing this down and teaching it in their schools, were essentially telling every new generation of scribes the same uncomfortable message. The world you live in was designed this way on purpose. The suffering you see is not random, and the being who designed it does not have your best interests at heart. Now there is one final layer to this that we should explore before the night takes us completely. And it concerns Enki's role after the flood, because after his brilliant defense before the assembly, after saving Zushudra through the reed wall loophole, Enki goes quiet in the textual record. He does not challenge the post-flood decrees. He does not speak to another reed wall to warn humanity about what has been decided for them. Scene 225b, video. Slow tracking shot of still water in an underground channel. No ripples, no movement. Warm blue. Green reflected light on the stone ceiling above the most talkative god in the Sumerian pantheon. The one who could not resist sharing knowledge goes completely silent when it matters most. Scene 225c, image, empty stone seat beside a pool of still water. No figure present. The seat worn smooth from use. Warm ambient light reflected off the water surface, vertical bar, zoom. The god of wisdom, the hero of the flood story, apparently accepted the population controls without the kind of creative defiance that defined his character. Why? The tablets don't say, but scholars have proposed several explanations that each cast the story in a different final light. One possibility is that Enki made a deal. He got humanity's survival in exchange for accepting the controls that would limit humanity forever. After. Another possibility is that Enki recognized the political limits of his position. He had won once. Pushing further might unite the other gods against him. And a third possibility, the one that some scholars find most compelling, is that the Sumerians were making a point about the limits of even wisdom itself. Enki could save humanity from extinction, but he couldn't save them from the conditions of their continued existence. Some problems have no clever solution. The reed wall trick worked once. It was brilliant. It was elegant. It was the most famous loophole in 4,000 years of recorded storytelling. But you can only use a loophole once before the authority closes it. And Enlil closed it by making the post-flood decrees public instead of secret. There is no wall to speak through when the decree is announced openly in the assembly and accepted by every god in the pantheon. And so, the Sumerian story of the flood ends not with hope, not with despair, but with something much more complicated and much more honest. It ends with the recognition that survival comes with conditions, that the world after catastrophe is not the same as the world before it, that the powerful will always find new ways to control what they cannot destroy, and that wisdom sometimes means knowing when a wall is just a wall. The Sumerians knew all of this 4,000 years ago. They wrote it on clay because clay lasts, and they wanted us to know it too. What Enlil really ordered before the flood was not just water, it was silence. Total absolute silence about what was about to happen to everyone. And what no human was supposed to know was not just the flood itself, but the entire framework of divine decision-making that led to it. The assembly, the debate, the failed plagues, the oath, the vote, the reasons, the aftermath, the ongoing controls still shaping daily life. All of it was supposed to stay behind closed divine doors. All of it was supposed to remain the private business of gods who answered to no one. But a god spoke to a wall, and a man built a boat, and a scribe pressed a stylus into clay and decided to record absolutely everything. And tonight, 4,000 years and countless civilizations later, you heard it all. The order, the loophole, the aftermath, the silence that was broken. These stories have been waiting in the clay for millennia. They'll still be there in the morning. For now, let the river carry you to sleep. Actually, there is one more thread worth unraveling before sleep. Something about the tablets themselves that changes how we read the entire flood story. We don't have one copy of the Atrahasis. We have fragments from multiple copies made across a span of roughly 1,000 years. The oldest fragments date to around 1700 BCE. The most complete copy comes from the library of Ashurbanipal around 650 BCE. That means scribes were copying this text for over 1,000 years, generation after generation, hand after hand, city after city preserving the same narrative. And each copy shows minor variations, different word choices, slightly different phrasings, but the core narrative stays remarkably consistent across every version. Enlil's order, the oath of silence, Enki's loophole, the reed wall, the flood, the gods weeping, the aftermath decrees, all of it preserved in every copy. No scribe in 1,000 years of copying decided to remove the part where the chief god makes a catastrophic moral error. No scribe decided to soften Enki's defiance, or remove the population control decrees, or make Enlil look more sympathetic to the human reader. They copied it faithfully, which tells us something important about what the Sumerians and their cultural successors valued in their historical record. Scene 254b image, close-up of two different scribal hands, writing the same cuneiform passage, one neat and one slightly rougher, both preserving the same content. Warm split lighting vertical bar zoom, then the Babylonians copied it. The Assyrians copied it. Even when empires fell and new powers rose, the next generation of scribes picked up the story and continued. Scene 254C, video, slow montage. Style tracking shot past different styles of cuneiform tablets, each representing a different period, warm, consistent museum lighting, linking them visually. They valued the uncomfortable truth over the comforting lie. At least in this text, at least for 1,000 years of continuous scribal tradition. And that might be the most remarkable thing Enlil's order produced in the end, not obedience, not silence, but a tradition of recording what power does when it thinks no one is watching. The flood was supposed to end humanity. Instead, it created the oldest surviving critique of unchecked authority in the history of written language. Enlil wanted silence. He got the most copied, most translated, most studied story in the ancient Near East instead of the silence, he demanded. Scholars today in London, Baghdad, Philadelphia, Berlin, and Tokyo are still reading what Enlil ordered to remain secret 4,000 years after the order was given. The clay one, the stylus one. The scribe who sat down and decided this story mattered enough to preserve in permanent form, that scribe won. And Enlil's order, the order that was supposed to be the final word on human existence, became instead the opening argument of a conversation that has lasted millennia. Every time someone reads this text, they're participating in the exact thing Enlil tried to prevent: humans knowing what the gods decided behind closed doors. There is a particular irony the Sumerians might have appreciated in all of this. The medium Enlil tried to wash away is the medium that survived best. Fire destroys papyrus, water dissolves ink, moths eat parchment, but clay tablets, when they get wet or burned, often become harder and more durable. The flood that was supposed to end everything actually helped preserve the tablets that recorded it, buried under mud and silt, sealed away from air and light, waiting patiently for someone with a brush and a dictionary to come along thousands of years later and finish reading the sentence. And that is what happened. In the ruins of Nineveh, in the collapsed libraries of Nippur, in the garbage dumps of ancient Sippar, where broken tablets were discarded, the story came back, piece by piece, fragment by fragment, join by join. The narrative was reassembled across decades of patient scholarly work. And now you know what Enlil really ordered. Not just water, not just death. Silence, secrecy, and a permanent system of control over the survivors. And you know what? Enki really did not just save one man. He created a precedent. A demonstration that unjust authority can be defied through cleverness. And you know what the scribes really did? Not just copy a story. They built a record of institutional injustice designed to outlast the institutions themselves. The temples of Enlil are gone. The cities of Sumer are ruins. The canals the humans dug have been dry for thousands of years. But the tablets are still here, in museums on every continent, in digital databases accessible to anyone with an internet connection and curiosity. What Enlil ordered before the flood was the end of everything. What actually happened was the beginning of one of humanity's oldest and most important stories. A story about power and wisdom, about secrecy and preservation, about walls that can be spoken through and clay that refuses to forget, and about a species that was created to serve, ordered to die, allowed to survive on conditions, and responded by writing down absolutely everything that happened. That is what no human was supposed to know. And now, 4,000 years later, everyone can know it. Because someone spoke to a wall, and someone else pressed a story into clay and made it last forever. Sleep well tonight. These tablets will still be waiting in the morning.